Many are called, but few are chosen. Not everyone is ready. The initiate is the one that chooses to take the path of purification, the purification of your soul. Today we talk about the path of the initiate.
Hey everyone, it's your girl Pluto. So happy to be here with you today, and my wonderful brother, Brother Mercuro.
Hi guys.
Very blessed to be able to do this special podcast series on the path of the initiate for you. So just a brief background on us. For myself, I have a background in psychology. I have a PhD in engineering, and I've also been a student of the mystery traditions for approximately 25 years. About the first maybe 8 to 10 years of my path, I spent focusing primarily on Eastern traditions, especially those of the Vedic traditions of India. And then I segued over into the Western mystery traditions. And my wonderful brother here, can you give us a description of your subject matter expertise?
Yeah, absolutely, and kind of followed a similar path. I have a psychological background, therapy background, and I also started off with the Eastern practices many years ago. I studied Zen, and I was involved in like a Zen Taoist group, which gave me a really good foundation for that. And then later moved into segued as well into the Western mysteries. And that's how we met, isn't it, really, on our Western mystery path. And and we've explored all sorts of topics in our own conversations, and I think we felt that it would be really interesting to discuss those on this video too. So we're going to call it the path of the initiate, right?
Yes, and that's going to be our topic today, the path of the initiate. What we'd like to touch on today essentially is the general themes of the initiate in various different traditions throughout the world, both East and West, and what you as an individual might expect with respect to your own personal development and spiritual development as you traverse the paths. Because while the techniques of individual paths may be different, they all do essentially culminate at the peak of what we refer to in the Western mystery traditions as the mountain of initiation. And so, while at the base of that mountain, the experiences may be very diverse and the techniques are diverse, one thing that's been widely reported throughout the centuries, if you review various mystical texts, is that as you begin to develop peak experiences and move closer and closer to unity consciousness, which is that consciousness where you are aligned with the underlying divine energy that is the source of all that's been created and uncreated. Though the experiences of the mystic begin to align as you get closer and closer to that peak. And that's one of the reasons why I consider myself, a universalist with respect to my own personal spiritual path. While I have studied the Western mystery traditions for approximately 2 decades now, I see the underlying unity in all of the traditions that I've studied, and I find value in all of the traditions as well. And I personally, from my own personal path, tend to incorporate a lot of my past practices in yoga and meditation, even things like pulse reading, into my Western mystical path, because I feel like they're a very good balance for me in terms of cultivating my internal landscape. So what's been your experience with your path? I know that you were doing Eastern for a while when you first started out. You moved into Western, and now you're kind of almost having like a new, a new kind of revelation in the Eastern paths again, which I find really inspiring.
Yeah, I that's the part I didn't say is I've started researching and looking into Western Tibetan Buddhist practice, which is fascinating. It's a really deep subject, and it's really, there's a lot of branches and areas on it. But I've been drawn back into that, I think partly because they have some very interesting and useful techniques for connecting with energies, particularly with mantra chanting and the types of visualization approach that's done. And it's enhanced also my Western mystery practice, in fact. So and it also, there's a way that they train you to think, in terms of compassion and in terms of opening up the heart center and the heart mind, which somehow automatically makes you, more compassionate to the world and have a desire to improve the world. And I think that aligns a lot with the Rosicrucian concepts, around, the rose blooming on the cross and wanting to better the world around you.
I think it's notable that for those who have studied the Golden Dawn Rosicrucian mystery tradition specifically, that the corpus of material does have elements of Eastern practices within it. And for those who study the history of the founders of those traditions, there's extensive writings on Eastern mystical practices. So clearly, the folks who were involved in kind of the early founding of, orders like the Golden Dawn were, they really held the Eastern mystery traditions in very high regard.
Absolutely, yeah. I guess because the Eastern side is very developed, and it has been and still is developed in a public way, whereas the Western mysteries, as we know, had to go underground due to persecution and various other factors. And so it was much more a tradition that was secret and, had to be hidden from the powers of the day, which happened to be the Catholic Church in Europe primarily. And so they've evolved differently. But I think also quite a lot of the Western mystery material was lost because of those factors. So some's being rediscovered, which is great. But the Eastern side has a much more public knowledge base, doesn't it? An experience base.
Yeah, that's true. And while I'm a Aquarius rising, so I tend to go off on little side quests. I'll try to keep it tailored to our topic today. One thing I think would be interesting for us to chat about sometime is the fact that mystery traditions, especially those that are considered precursors to something like the Golden Dawn, like the Eleusinian mysteries, have always been more secret. And I find that quite compelling as somebody who is, very interested in the Greek mystery traditions myself, that in ancient Greece, the way that people lived was very different than how we live today. They didn't see a separation between their spiritual life and their mundane life or their regular life. It wasn't, I go and do my practice on the yoga mat and then I go to work and never the twain shall meet. They looked at everything from a spiritual and magical perspective, as did the Egyptians and the Kabbalists. But yet their traditions were still secret. You were, under pain of death when you were initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries. You could say nothing. And so, later on, when the Golden Dawn was founded in the 1800s, there was the idea of like a protection. But I'm interested to maybe kind of just go down that pathway at some point. So I'm going to throw that one out there. Maybe we can chat about that in another podcast. But one thing I'm interested in knowing from you, since we both have backgrounds in Eastern practices and Western mystery practices, is what has been your experience with respect to the similarities and differences between the experience that you have when you are engaging in your Eastern practices versus the Western mystery practices?
Right. Yeah, that's a really good question. And also going on your previous comment, I agree with that. I think there's a hidden side and a public side. And even the ancient times, even though it was integrated into their society, you had to be ready, which I guess we'll come on to when we talk about initiation. You had to be ready to kind of accept that and study those mysteries, and someone had to have assessed you and talked to you and understood where you're at spiritually in order to admit you into those things. I think the East also has this is one of the similarities, I guess. They also have a secret side, you know. It's just that the public side's much more open, and you know, the books are much more accessible and have been for many years. But I think there is a secret side, and it tends to be more related to gurus and specific teachers, doesn't it? So that if you sign up with a particular teacher, they'll start imparting you by word of mouth a lot of the secret knowledge that you get, which is similar to Western mysteries. You know, we also have that, but you won't get that in the public domain so much. All people will see is, like, if you've done that particular practice, you might display certain qualities, or you might even perform feats that are seen as miraculous, but it's basically because you've mastered a particular type of energy and you've had the training. So I think there is that balance, isn't there, between what's secret and what's in public. And we see now so many books out there on the Western mysteries that the knowledge itself is public, but the application of it is still secret. It's still held by those who have experience and who are adepti. So I think the other big difference to me is that there seem to be in the Western mysteries a lot more structured ritual. And perhaps the Eastern still has that bit, you know, hidden in other ways, but it seems to be much more relaxed in that respect, and people perhaps do things in different ways. Whereas in the West, particularly, as you say, the Golden Dawn and paths like that have a very structured approach in terms of their ritual. And the point of that is to contain energies, isn't it? You know, if you have a structure, you can actually contain specific magical energies. So there are different approaches that way. But
Yeah,
I don't know, what do you think?
Well, what I find interesting is there's separate approaches to what I think are the same thing. So Eastern practices tend to be very entrenched in practices associated with non-attachment. And in practicing non-attachment, that speaks to training your animal nature. If you're not attached to something, if you allow the experience to flow through you, whether it's a good, you know, a good or a bad experience, you don't let yourself become attached to the feeling. You know, you just let yourself experience it without trying to grasp onto it. Then that releases you from the animal nature, which, you know, is that part that wants to, you know, sequester resources or maintain a certain state because it's pleasurable. Whereas what I've noticed with the Western mystery traditions is they use more of a regimen to train the animal nature, almost like you might train a pet or something like that, you know, to like put it in will. But developing and cultivating your willpower is also something that is, you know, very, very unique and emphasized, I think, in the Western mystery traditions.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. It is a different approach, isn't it, in that way? I mean, I guess the human nature is the human nature, so it does, training it is part of the process, isn't it? In order to reduce the impact of that and to reduce the noise or the interference when you're practicing, you know, Western magical processes. You know, it's very difficult if your lower nature is always hungry, or it's interrupting you with emotions or things like that. You know, it's like you're not going to achieve your ritual. So
yeah, and you can't get in touch with your true self either if you're constantly distracted by fluctuations in your consciousness. Then how can you actually listen to, you know, what your true self, or what is referred to in the Western traditions as, you know, your holy guardian angel, your higher genius, your bornless spirit, the phase before you were born. All these also, this concept of the true self, that part of you that's always in connection with the divine, you know, being reflected in the Eastern traditions as well, in phrases like, you know, the Adepts, Brahman, and you know, the idea that there is a part of us that is divine, and and we're removing those veils, we're settling the mind so we can have a clear connection with that part of ourselves.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose, that's the goal of the Western mystery initiation, isn't it? Is to start that process. I have a definition here, if it's helpful. Initiation is the action of beginning something and the action of admitting someone into a secret or obscure society or group, typically with a ritual. What do you reckon to that?
I agree. And going back to a talking point that you had, initiations are highly incorporated into Eastern practices as well. It makes me actually kind of wonder, now that there's so much, information out there in the public eye in terms of Western mystery practices, if it's kind of culminating the same thing that we have with the Eastern practices, right? You can find and access that information and maybe even try your hand at it to a certain degree, but being initiated, gives you access to trained mentors, masters, gurus, and it also, bestows a current, an energy upon you, a transmission. That's important in those traditions. There might be, one Eastern practice that became heavily incorporated into the West back in the 70s was transcendental meditation. And I myself am a TMer, and when I did both, my initial TM training and the TM city,
peace out. Yeah.
we had to go through an initiation, and the one for the TM cities was very ritualistic, and there was certainly, a transmission of current. And they spoke about it like that too, right? It's a transmission of an energy from the guru of that tradition into the student, so that they can access those higher states of consciousness as they perform what are known as the TM cities techniques. The cities techniques being, particular mantras that you say during your meditation that allow you to access, even higher states of consciousness, and may even result in kind of supernormal experiences. But for them in that tradition, which is based on the Vedic traditions of India, that doesn't occur unless you have a guru or a master to transmit that current. Kind of like it's like the initial practices, the earlier practices ripen your consciousness, and then as the current is placed, it like kind of pops it out like a seed, right? Like pops your consciousness open and breaks it open so that you can perceive things, in a vastly different way than you did before. And I think that's very akin to the initiatic traditions of Chaldee, the Eleusinian mysteries, the Rosicrucian initiations, and the Kabbalistic, initiatic experience as well.
Absolutely. And it's almost like a rebirth. It's like you're being reborn, as you say, in a new way of thinking. And that's reflected in a lot of the traditions, isn't it? It's sort of in the West in particular, there's initiations often involve a period of darkness or privation or being hidden away, and then a sort of leading through that out into the light. So saying the golden dawn, quit the night and seek the day. I think that perhaps sums up the initiatory process, doesn't it? Because what you're trying to do is get your subconscious or your inner world to shift somehow into a point where it can now start connecting with that higher self, as mentioned earlier. And to do that, it has to go through a symbolic process, doesn't it? It has to almost have symbols and experiences imprinted on it to enable that to happen. And of course, as we know, the unconscious mind responds much more to symbols and images and sounds and things than it does to words.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess that,
a lot of people don't know or recognize that the subconscious part of our experience is much more, it's far more robust. The limbic system, takes up a greater part of our brain than the frontal lobe does. And our frontal lobe can only remain active for so long. And as the brain, you know, just like the rest of the body, you know, seeks to stay in a state of homeostasis to preserve energy, you know, when somebody goes through emotion or something over and over again, there's a time when the brain has become so well aware of what the actions are that it's the limbic system that kicks in rather than the analytical frontal lobes. Like when you're driving to work, you know, you've driven to work like, you know, 20 times. Well, probably after like the third or fourth time, when you really know the pathway to work, what are you doing, right? You're looking on your phone, you're playing with the radio, you're doing all that kind of stuff. Why? Because your analytical mind doesn't need to be active anymore, or doesn't feel like it needs to. The limbic system's taken over. And that's the part of it's associated with the subconscious and more the animal nature as well. And so we think about animals and their consciousness, they, you know, they respond more to you know, visual images and sounds, whereas, you know, we as, you know, with human minds, the way that they've developed, we can respond to, you know, more types of stimuli, but still, you know, the brain wants to trigger back into that state. And so it can have a lot of control over us until we learn how to become master of that.
Well, right. And that's what we're doing, isn't it, in this mystical practice? A classic example is like, you know, someone tells themselves, I'm not going to eat chocolate today. And then they see a bar of chocolate in front of them, and then they start smelling it, and then they start, you know, and that limbic system kicks in. And then you just, okay, I'm just doing it. You know? So there's psychological experiments around that, I'm sure, you know, and the ability to resist something and seeing how long you
like
can
that
do it.
marshmallow experiment.
Yeah, right, with the kids. Yeah. So those things, I think, are what the initiations and Western and Eastern practices are designed to tame, in a way, aren't they? To kind of help us to understand what's happening there and how we can use symbols and sounds and other experiences to understand and control those things. And that's when you start to get the siddhis, as you say, and all the more esoteric abilities that come out of these practices.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. You know, what I have recognized over the years is the first steps of any process of initiation, regardless of what tradition you're in, always entail training the human part of our nature, our impulses, our fears, towards, you know, things like loneliness, pain, death, which really rule a lot of our mind, fears and insecurities related to our social networks and how they impact us. You know, one of the reasons I love the system of yoga is it's an 8-limbed system. And a lot of, you know, people who may be unfamiliar with yoga think about yoga just as the physical postures, which are known as the asanas. But the asanas aren't actually the whole system. It's like the third or fourth limb of yoga. The first few limbs of yoga have to do with training, you know, training your human nature with respect to behavior in the moral and ethical realms, and learning how to control yourself as a person so that you can be a master of that. And then you move into things like the physical postures, the asanas, and different types of breath work as manners of purifying your energy system. And all of that's still preparation for sitting in meditation, and then practicing things like one-pointed awareness, which essentially kind of like train your mind, focus your mind, you know, onto one thing, so you can just at some point what's known as transcend that and then experience, you know, global consciousness. But it's all about taking this big experience and whittling it down over time.
Yeah.
And then once you get to the one point, you
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know what you think, but sometimes I think that's missing from the Western path. And often people will just rush into doing magic and, you know, performing rituals without that preparation, without that practice. And, you know, there's the classic thing about the magical ego and all of that kind of thing that happens. I suspect that those practices, if someone was starting off with those, it might help prevent some of the pitfalls later on. I don't know. What do you think?
I certainly agree with you. It's one of the reasons why I personally have continued to incorporate certain Eastern practices into my magical practice, because I feel that at least for myself, the Eastern practices are uniquely tailored to helping me to moderate my internal landscape in terms of my thoughts and my impulses. And I don't think it's necessarily absent from the tradition. I think what has happened over time is that people who maybe haven't studied the breadth of the tradition or the history of the tradition, or maybe just haven't been taught to perceive those aspects of it, it didn't get, you know, translated over time to them and then to their students. But, you know, even people like Aleister Crowley were very firm in, you know, developing things like one-pointed awareness and, you know, incorporating practices that helps them to tailor their internal landscape, because they recognized that self-mastery is the key to illumination. But what I have experienced very similar to you over the years is that, you know, the human mind likes fun stuff, right? It likes the cool stuff, and robe and wave wands around and you know, bring on the
absolutely, yeah.
And so the human mind gets attached to this very, like, you know, the cool kind of, I don't know, theatrical aspects. And so, you know, early on, and so a lot of people miss those kind of key elements. And I see that too when it comes to something like studying the initiations. I see this happen all the time. The initiations are full of symbolism and full of things that the analytical brain has a very difficult time comprehending. And the idea of going through the fine details and really understanding the symbolism is arduous, right?
Oh, yeah.
When, especially when you got something over here that looks like a lot cooler to do some rituals.
Right.
But it's the initiations. The initiation ceremonies are the key to the whole tradition. If you understand and master your understanding of the initiations and advancement ceremonies, then everything else opens itself up to you. And if you really take the time to study those ceremonies, they show you the formula of how to train your body, your mind, your emotions, your passions. It's all right there, right? But you have to have control of yourself and let yourself find the passion in doing those kind of studies, not just intellectually, but really meditating to understand the symbolism on a deeper level. But I'll tell you what, if you love ritual magic, you love ritual work, studying the initiations enhances your experience to a degree that a lot of people never truly come to understand, mainly because they never take the time to really focus on them.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. I think there are a lot of folks out there who just want the quick fix, and you know, I want to be able to do magic instantly. My Western Buddhist teacher calls it Mac Dharma. You know, it's a bit like Mac magic. You know, people want to read a book and then they can do it, but that's not how it works. You know, as you say, you need initiation, you need to study, you need to understand things. I think that one of the differences with the Western mysteries is there's a lot of study. There's a lot more reading of material and things. And I think that's probably because the Western nature needs that to occupy their intellect, so that then the symbols can come in behind that, you know, because we are so focused. We're so focused on the. I know Westcott said something like that. And Dion Fortune has written about that some of the reasons that the Western mysteries are so fact intensive and having to learn things is because it's a way to to lead people from a state of a very intellectual culture and climate into a much more inner world. But you've got to begin at the beginning, haven't you? You know, people aren't ready necessarily to go into deeper symbology and things until they've satisfied, I suppose, their brain and their kind of a part of them that wants knowledge. And you see a lot of people, so-called armchair magicians, who get stuck in that, and they're great experts on all the content, but they haven't done any ritual work. So I think that's where it gets stuck sometimes. But hopefully, if you've got good teachers, they'll lead you from that then into the much more experiential side.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about, actually, because if, you know, we're tailoring our discussion more to the Golden Dawn tradition and more like modern Western mystical traditions. You know, they're founded in, you know, primarily the, you know, mysteries of Egyptian culture, Greek culture, and then the Kabbalistic traditions as well as the Rosicrucian. And, you know, as we were discussing earlier, those ancient societies were culturally embedded. I'll bring Rome into this too. The Roman culture. They looked at everything as magic. Everything was magic. There was no separation in their mind. That separation came into our world, in my personal opinion, you know, during the scientific revolution, where we started, you know, teasing things out. And very ironically, a lot of the technology that, you know, came out of the scientific revolution, or was a precursor to the scientific revolution, came from mystical traditions. You know, the Sir Isaac Newton, I think, is a great example, as well as Paracelsus. You know, Newton being the, you know, the father of physics, classical physics, and Paracelsus being the father of chemistry, both alchemists. Both of them, the main, you know, most of their writings, the bulk of their writings pertaining to alchemy and mysticism. And they developed, you know, incredible, what we would consider just like incredible feats of science. And I personally think it's because they were immersed in higher states of consciousness. So they were able to derive these principles from the you know, the spiritual realm. This also reflected, you know, in Einstein's work too. Einstein would talk about how when he was trying to, you know, really figure something out, and his intellectual mind was just, you know, creating a wall, he'd sit essentially in his chair with a ball, and he'd let himself fall asleep. And as he entered this hypnagogic state, right, the state right before you fall asleep, it frees up the frontal lobe, right, and gives you flexibility. That's when all of the stuff would come to him. And he was also very spiritual. He was, you know, Jewish, and so to me, you know, those kind of stories show that the great feats of science that we're so thankful for today are founded in mystical paths, right? But yet we've separated them out and poo-pooed now the spiritual side for a really long time, and made science so dry. We can tell you all kinds of stuff about many, many things, but that hasn't translated into a feeling of self-worth, genuine living, passionate living. You know, we have all this technology, and yet, you know, we're on social media all day, every day, but people feel disconnected. They feel lonely. You know, why is that, right? So I think now we're having a swing back, and I think there's going to be a balance that's going to start being created between the sciences, the hard sciences, and the spiritual, what I call spiritual sciences.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think people often say that quantum physics is part of that bridge, doesn't it? And it's bringing people back to, you know, connecting science and religion or spiritual practices together, which is great. I think that will develop further, as you say, and particularly these Pluto Aquarius energies. I think that's something where we'll see great leaps forward, right? in that area, hopefully. But,
I think so too. You know, Pluto and Aquarius is generally associated with huge leaps in technology. And in that out of the box thinking, you know, that Aquarius energy is out of the box thinking. And if you just, even if you don't believe in that stuff, right? If you just look at how things have been going historically for the past 5 decades, there's been a general unease with the status quo. People want more and they're not feeling satisfied. This is why we had a huge kind of flush, almost like Eastern kind of revolution back in the 70s. And things have been continuing on, and people have been feeling unsettled with the kind of old guard, religious structures, or for those who maybe have maintained connections to them, they're seeking to deepen their path almost in a more mystical way. You see a lot of stuff about passionate prayer, God-centered prayer, not just the dear Lord, please do this thing for me prayer, but Lord, how can I develop a relationship with you? When I was young, my father's side of the family is Catholic and my mother's side of the family is Protestant. Not in either of those areas did I ever hear anything about developing a relationship with God. It was go to church, learn, here's the scripture. What does it mean for you to be a good person in your life? In the Catholic Church, they have the Eucharist, which I found myself more compelled towards because I felt the energy of that. I could tell it was mystical at a young age. And I have no judgments against the churches that offer that. But, the way people are approaching even going to church now, generally speaking, I have found is very different. People want to feel God within them. They know they're divine. They know that they were created in the image of the divine, and people they're ready to move into that new space.
Absolutely. And you can see a big growth in things like the Pentecostal movement and others like that, where there is a need, and those places provide the real feeling, the sulfur, like the real sense of connection with with God, I guess, and they emphasize that. And whereas a lot of the older traditions tend to emphasize the rules, don't they? It's sort of like, go learn the rules and be a good person. But in Tree of Life terms, you get stuck at Hode. You don't get any further, and nothing manifests because you're kind of just fixed on the rules and feeling guilty if you don't go on Sunday. That doesn't actually help. If it's living, it's a living process. Even Jesus said it's supposed to be the living waters. Then you do get involved in that experience, don't you? And you do start to absorb from it. I think the East is slightly better at that. Going back to the other thing I wanted to say, that's right. Going back to what you said about the alchemists who brought in change into our society, like Paracelsus and so on. I think if they were members of a Rosicrucian fraternity, which is possible, two of the driving things about Rosicrucianism is one, that to healing people, and that gratis, as it says in the public, any public document you can find Rosicrucianism, it should say those things. And also to improve the world around you, to improve society. And at the time those things were happening, I think there was a Pluto Aquarius shift going on, lots of innovation. I don't know, I need to get the timeline right, but those guys did try and improve society, and that's possibly what we have to thank for Europe being as it is, because they put a lot of effort into transforming and getting away from the religious focus onto a more scientific focus. And maybe you're right, it's gone too far now, it needs to kind of swing back to the middle. But it did create a very positive change in our part of the world. Whereas, other places followed a very different path. So I think that's very interesting and very critical. In fact, I remember Westcott, one of the founders of Golden Dawn, was passionate about Paracelsus because he was a doctor. And Paracelsus said a lot about medicine and, understanding the science behind it and so on. So it was really innovative at the time. So I think those things are really important to know about and to mention, because where I guess I'm going off topic slightly, but where I'm trying to come back to is that when you have an initiation, you become part of that. I think you become part of the movement that can tap into the pure, living waters of the divine, and that inspires you to create change and to improve the world, and to heal. I don't know, that's just my take on it.
No, you're right. I actually, I'm really glad that you brought that up, because, you know, in some previous comments, you were talking about how a lot of people, you know, there's been a lot of experience with people where being involved in spirituality just meant following the rules and feeling guilty. You know, your litmus test for your quality of who you were as a person in your life was, did you follow the rules, right? Kind of like the Pharisees. Did I do it well enough? Did I follow the rules well enough, right? And Christ came in and said, hey, look, it's not all about following the rules. And, you know, he was very radical, character and historical character. But when you enter into a pathway of initiation, the whole purpose is to learn how to strip yourself of the things that are holding you back, so you can live a passion-driven life, a sulfur-filled life, because it's the sulfur that allows you to connect with the Mercury, the spirit, right? And then it's, of course, it's bound in the salt and the physical. Something that's very relevant to the Eastern practices, especially some of the tantric and Buddhist texts, where they believe that, you know, the physical body is essentially the vessel by which enlightenment takes place. And they have, you know, certain practices like Kundalini yoga and different, you know, breathing practices and such to purify the body, so it can be, you know, essentially the sanctuary that will host and hold the sulfur and the mercury, or the spirit and the soul. But yeah, I mean, what kind of life would you rather live? One where you wake up every day and you feel like crap because you didn't follow all the rules the right way, you know? Or one in which you want to follow whatever those rules are because you feel because you want to honor the divine within you. You recognize the reason certain things may be guidelines or rules isn't to make you feel guilty. It's to help remove things from your life that keep you from the spirit, you know? And that's a totally different way to approach a system, right? Because any system, right? A system indicates there's structure to it, right? And in those phases of structure in any system, there's rules and things like that to help you train the different parts of you, you know, to help you to become a master. But you never become a master of yourself when you're holding on to guilt, because guilt's just an element of fear, right? So fear, holds you back from everything.
Your lower self kicking in again. Yeah, absolutely. I completely understand why the East focus a lot on non-attachment then, because that's the key to it, isn't it, really? If you can learn to separate yourself and your mind from being driven by the external world, you know, in psychology terms, you move from an external locus of control to an internal locus of control. And you start to respond to your higher self rather than responding to what someone said to you in the street, or, you know, a family member shouts at you. You start to learn and realize that actually you're the one in control. It's not those things. They're not driving you, are they? And apparently ascribed to the Buddha is a quote which says, you know, resentment is like drinking poison but expecting the other person to die, which I think is great. You know, it kind of sums this up in the sense that, you know, when you've usually through initiation and other practices, you begin to realize that actually what you're experiencing in yourself is unique, and it's not what other people see necessarily. You know, you might be upset with someone, but they don't know that unless you communicate it. Or vice versa, you know, someone might be shouting at you, but you may not understand the reason. And I find myself beginning to have compassion for people, because I start to say, well, there's obviously something troubling you inside. You know, there's like a thing you need to resolve, and you know, let's try and help you with that. Whereas I think when we're younger, we're much more reactive, aren't we? We just respond to the world oh, they're calling me this, or yeah, or why are you shouting at me? And you get more involved in conflict. Whereas I think as you mature and grow spiritually, you begin to realize actually it's about how you change yourself.
Right. Well, when you're a child and your frontal lobe isn't developed all the way. For those of
True.
you who don't know this, the analytical part of your brain doesn't fully develop until you are hitting just your 20s. So
Yeah.
children have to be taught in a very binary way. If you do this, this is the reaction. And people get conditioned to be reactive, to think black and white. And maturity is the development of an understanding that there's a gradient that exists. And also that just because there are things going on around us, we can choose whether we want to react to it or not. And it's our reaction to something that determines the experience that we have. So if somebody says something to you, you get to choose how you interpret that. You might be prone to interpreting it one way, but you can train yourself to say, oh, stop. Do I really want to think about it that way? And if I do, how does that impact me? Is that going to be better for me and for them and for the situation? Or not? And then allow yourself to enter into like a new thought process, which can become then a pattern and replace those old patterns.
Yeah, and you become master of yourself, don't you? You begin to master your mind and so on, which is also the goal of the Western mysteries. So, well, all the mystery paths, I suppose. So yeah, it's fascinating, I think, all of this. Maybe that's also the antidote to this whole oversensitivity thing that's going on in the world. People are sensitive about everything, but partly because they have that external focus. The more you kind of have an internal focus, you become less sensitive to what other people say.
That's
criticism
true. You do.
and all
You
of that.
do. It doesn't mean you become less sensitive as an individual. It just means, I think it means you become less reactive, right?
Yeah.
You can still feel things. That's the thing about non-attachment that I feel like I always got to clarify with people is it's not about pushing things away or pushing them down or repressing not feeling or not experiencing it. It is recognizing that certain stimuli are coming into your brain and resulting in an experience of feeling, but being able to control how you react even when that feeling exists. And as you learn how to manage yourself mentally and emotionally, that experience that you're used to having can be transmuted into a different experience. So, I used to have chronic anxiety, like true chronic anxiety. I would, if it got triggered by something and it didn't go away in like 2 or 3 days, I could have 24-hour anxiety for weeks, sometimes to months. And, it was horrible. It was terrible. And I, of course the doctors, they want to give me, anti-anxiety meds and all this kind of stuff. Which what I did is I learned how to understand when it was appropriate to take and not, because it wasn't something I needed to take all the time. It was like an acute thing. But I used my magical practice and I used my Eastern practices to help myself moderate up front. And only if I couldn't get myself to the level, because there was like a biochemical reinforcement going on in my brain, then I would take, the very small dose of the antidepressant. But I found that, or the anti-anxiety medication. And I found that to be very critical to me healing through the chronic anxiety, because I wasn't depending on just some outside, pharmaceutical drug to help me moderate. I was teaching my brain, how to be different. And, I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm like a neuropsychology nerd. So,
Oh yeah, no, it's interesting. Yeah.
another thing I feel like people should really understand is this kind of stuff's not hocus pocus, right? It's real, it's physical.
Mm.
When every experience you have creates a neural connection. And when you have that same experience or similar experience over time, you create a neural bundle. And that's why it's easy to have habits and thought patterns, but you can change that by, stopping those patterns. Then the neural bundle atrophies. And while that's happening, you're making new connections and new neural bundles. You can physically change your brain,
Yep.
to be different.
That's so interesting, isn't it? So exciting that we can do that. We have that power. They call it neuroplasticity or something like that.
That's right. Neuroplasticity.
Yeah, yeah, it's so interesting, and I think that's why things like cognitive behavior therapy work really well, and some of these other interventions that have been shown through research to be very effective because it trains people or retrains their brain and their way of thinking to a much more adaptive pattern and gets rid of depression, for example. It's just as good as that.
Magical practice, meditation practice,
Yeah,
mantra practice, all of those have very similar impacts to the physical brain.
well, yeah, there's been some great recent research on that. I think Jonathan Kabat-Zinn at University of California did a lot of research on meditation and mindfulness, and I think he hooked up a number of very experienced meditators to an EEG. The brain, for those out there who don't know what that is, it's electroencephalogram, which is like where you put nodes onto your skin on your head, and it measures your brain patterns and brain waves. And they found that those guys could really seriously control their brain patterns. I mean, they more than the average person, because they practiced meditation for such a long time. And that led to the development of mindfulness and mindfulness-based CBT as a kind of psychology intervention. So that's very effective. They've built it into interventions that help people stop self-harming, for example, stop cutting their wrists, or like DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, incorporates that as part of this work. So it is out there. Like, we do know this. It's not just hocus pocus, as you say. It's like when you do a lot of this work, we're using old technology for the same thing, but right. It works. Yeah. Right. So
it really does. And I don't know if you knew this or not, but I actually used to work in an EEG lab where I studied meditators.
Oh, right. I didn't know that.
For a while, yeah. and
cool.
And we didn't study it from the perspective that you were just speaking of, in terms of maybe looking at mindfulness or other meditation techniques as something for therapeutic benefits. We were looking at how meditation impacts the physiology of the brain. And, one of the very notable characteristics is it reduces cognitive dissonance. So a lot of psychological issues that people have, are due to kind of like miscommunication of the different lobes. And when you meditate, you can see on the EEG, and then in the brain scans, how the brain lights up in this kind of almost like cohesive fashion. And it, going back to that remodeling, when you practice meditation on a very regular basis, right, it recreates your brain so that you become more focused, calmer, less anxiety. You can think better, clearer, moderate your emotions. I mean, there's endless benefits to mystical practices like meditation, that aren't even considered spiritual in modern society. It's just well known now, and like the example you gave, becoming integrated, into the sciences and into therapy. So
yeah, and I think that's going to happen more and more, isn't it? Probably, in 10 years' time, we'll find even more of that going on. I guess the only criticism people have of those things is that it doesn't include the context that you get when you're studying, it through the same thing through a yoga lens or a Zen meditation lens. So it may not be as effective without that context. but I guess it's developing. So perhaps people will begin to find another way to explain that.
I gotta start somewhere.
Yeah,
It's
exciting.
I think I'm going to end on this, and then I'll give you the floor
All right.
for closing. But yeah, I'm just reminded of there's this yoga teacher that I studied with for a little while, and it was kind of during this time where yoga is being introduced into the gyms and all that kind of stuff. And we were having a similar conversation to this, and she said, I don't really have any issue with it. She said people come because they want to have the yoga butt, but they stay because they recognize there's something deeper. And I really loved that because, yeah, maybe you come across certain mystical techniques in therapies or for, other reasons, just as a way to self-moderate or just give your brain some rest or whatnot. But in having those experiences, you recognize there's something deeper, can very much be a gateway for people. So I'm all about it. The more, the better. I really hope that people come to find their way to these very useful techniques that not only provide a better quality of life, but can allow people to live a very passion-driven life that has meaning for them every day, because that's really what people want. And in my opinion, what people deserve.
Absolutely. Yeah, I completely concur with that. And yeah, I'll end on saying, for anyone who's interested in that out there, do Google up, search up Jonathan Kabat-Zinn, Kabat-Zinn. He's the professor at University of California who studied the meditation. There's plenty of others out there as well, because it's becoming, the consciousness studies is becoming such a big thing these days. And also, take a look at the different initiatory practices. The Tibetan meditation tradition is very formalized, but you've also got the yogic, different branches of the yogic system. Then you've got the Western mysteries. Classically, Golden Dawn is a big one, but obviously check that. Look at their websites and see whether you feel right with that, because it's got to be right for you. And there's even sort of self-initiation where you pretty much take a decision that, from this day, I'm now going to start working on myself and find possibly your own practices that you might want to do. So there's many ways to start advancing yourself and developing yourself internally. And as you say, Pluto, it's like about finding meaning and purpose in your life, isn't it? And having a happy life. So we can all do that. In fact, I think they should teach that in schools, but they don't, well, some maybe, but
maybe one day.
That's something one day, yeah.
we could do to that. And I guess I do want to maybe just make one more final comment. For people who come from more traditional, I'll say that in air quotes, traditional religious backgrounds, if you look into it, it's highly likely that your tradition has a mystical practice associated with it. There's mystical Christian practices. There's mystical Islamic practices.
Sufism. Yeah.
Sufism. There's pretty much all of the religious traditions of the world have a mystical side, a mystical component. So, if you're interested in deepening your relationship with the divine, but you really favor, the religious upbringing that you've had, or you've maybe come back to your religion after some time and formulated a new relationship with the divine through that, you can continue to deepen that relationship with practices that, probably already exist. And if you feel like, you want a little help or guidance with that, you're welcome to reach out to us on the platform, on our Facebook, drop some comments in the YouTube, on the gram, and just say, hey, look, this is what I'm looking at. Do you have any resources? Any one of us will be happy to respond to you and help you to find, a pathway that works for you. So.
Yeah, put some comments down below if you like. We'll take a look at those when they're there, and like and subscribe if you're interested in this. We'll be doing more, won't we? We'll be getting together and talking about some other subjects soon. So thank you for listening. It's been great opportunity to talk about these things, and we hope that everyone out there finds their way, their path, and their sense of enjoyment in life.
Yeah, amen to that. Well, brother, it was really nice to get to do this with you today. We love you,
Thank you.
everyone. Can't wait to see you next time.
Put it that way.
Yeah.
Yep.
Have a beautiful week. Mwah. We'll see you next time. Bye.
See you. Bye for now.